Same thing happened to us, however, vis-a-vis the cavern, because the cavern, the cathedral really is a closed-in, it's still a cavern, whether it's Gothic or Romanesque. And as we'll see with Gebser, it took us a while to break out of that closed universe that we inherited from the Magians, and we have sort of dual pseudomorphosis, a very heavy Greco-Roman influence and a very heavy Near Eastern Jewish influence. And between these two parent cultures, it took us a while to find our own expression forms. This is why Joseph Campbell comes in and he says, having read Spengler, he comes in and he says, the Abrahamic religions have nothing to do with our civilization. They're based on a totally different structure of thinking, a consensus mentality versus the individual mentality. In our civilization, we question authority. You know, we have this tradition of questioning authority that you don't have in the Magian culture. And bringing Christianity over into Northern Europe was the imposition of a false form onto Europe, just as Russia now is suffering from a pseudomorphosis by the way of the imposition of European culture forms. They're having trouble finding their own expression language, but they'll break out of it sooner or later. But you know, St. Peter the Great coming in and coming to Europe and copying all the architecture in Europe and then going back to Petersburg and building this city that's based on a copy of European architecture. And then you get Dostoevsky centuries later saying, you know, St. Petersburg feels like a ghost town to me. It doesn't feel authentic. And so the Russians are still struggling to break out of their pseudomorphosis. And it takes a while, but once it happens, it's quite dynamic. And so this sort of, in a scaled-down model, is Spengler's vision of these closed-in cultures. And the final point that I want to make is with respect to the morphology of these cultures in terms of the sort of 1,000-year arc that I talked about. There are these distinct stages within that each one of these cultures goes through. There's a pre-culture stage. There's an early culture stage. A late culture stage. And then the final decadent period is civilization. There's a distinction in German that doesn't exist in English between culture with a K and civilization, where culture refers to a civilization inspired by art, and civilization refers to an inorganic civilization that's just based on organization, megalopolitan, gigantic, overpopulated, but uninspired for the most part. And these correspond to, you know, spring, summer, autumn, and winter of the cycle of the culture in question. So it's very organic morphology that unfolds over these, you know, it's about 250 years apiece for those to make up for the 1,000-year arc. Although the civilization phase, once attained, can last for a very long time. The Romans ended up short. They could have gone for a while with that imperial organization. That can last for a long time. Once you get into that phase, the creativity slowly dies down, as it did when you look at Roman history. They just sort of stop thinking about things, and they just sort of they cease becoming interested in innovation and start copying. You know, they can't build works of art anymore, so they start, you know, hodgepodge putting things together. The creative life is just, vitality is just dying out of the culture. If you look at the Faustian civilization, just as a quick demonstration, and we say the pre-culture period of the Faustian civilization begins about the year 1000 AD. Spengler says it usually begins with lots of apocalyptic imagery. And the sign of apocalyptic imagery is the sign that a new civilization is coming into being, because it's the sudden intuition of this fascination with death that marks the birth of a new culture. And the same might be said for our culture, which is fascinated with apocalypticism right now. Something new is coming out of this, possibly, which we'll see what Gebser says about that tomorrow. So right about the year 1000 AD, you get the Romanesque cathedral comes in as the culture form. You get these anonymous epics. The Beowulf story is written down, and you get the Song of Roland, and you get the Nibelungenlied. They're all these sort of collective epics written by anonymous people. We don't know who put them together, and they represent the folk soul of the, you know, the Song of Roland is the primary epic of France during this period. And then that period concludes with the Grail romances, where now you start to get specific writers coming in and articulating the mythology of Europe as the individual quest for fulfillment. And that represents the sort of transition into the early culture period, and the transition from the Romanesque architecture to the Gothic architecture, which happens at the same time as the Grail quests are being written out. Grail literature dates from 1180 to 1210. The discovery of the Gothic cathedrals about 1150. Both signify this transition into the early culture period. And then polyphony is first, well, you get Gregorian chant first in music, and then polyphony comes in at about the same time and signifies the shift. So you have polyphony, and you have the Grail romances and the Gothic architecture all coming into being about the same time. Then you get the early culture period, and you get these sort of, in the literature sphere, you get these individualized epics by the Italians, Tasso and Ariosto, and they're sort of picking up these faint echoes of medieval literature. But then you get the novel starts to come in with Don Quixote, and then you have Shakespeare's plays coming in, and then the transition in terms of the architecture is from the cathedral now to the princely palaces of the Baroque. You start moving into this late culture period in between the sort of summer and autumn. The primary architectural fascination becomes these wonderful princely palaces from the Baroque period. And you move from this sort of early theocratic phase to an aristocratic phase, and then the middle classes begin coming in here. Then you sort of, the late culture winds up with the Socratic man coming in on stage. The intellect comes in, begins to sterilize everything out of existence. You get the Age of Reason, with Voltaire and Rousseau and this French Enlightenment period, and the culture begins to sort of stiffen a bit. And then the sort of final climax of the culture period comes in with the novel coming into full maturity at the end of the 18th century, Tom Jones and Clarissa and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and all of that. And then that begins to wind down. And then, of course, right about this time, if you wind back one century, you get the birth of classical music in its grand style. Toward the end of the 17th century, you get Bach coming in, and then you have the transition into the 18th century where classical music becomes the primary art form of the 18th century. Painting has done about what it's going to do with the perspectival style and fades into the background for a while. Classical music steps on stage, and all the great masters come in: Mozart, Haydn, Gluck, Stamitz. All these individuals come in, and then the transition to the late winter phase begins to happen with Beethoven, where the classical, he begins to sort of analyze these forms out of existence. The creative output between Mozart is gigantic, and compared to the number of things that Beethoven wrote, is very small compared. So you had, that once you start getting into that struggle where creativity becomes more and more difficult, something's dying out in the culture. Spengler says, by the way, populations, when they get into this very late winter stage, begin to die out. And they sort of, once you enter into this kind of megalopolitan civilization phase, and people start debating about whether they should or should not have children, you passed the spontaneity point of the culture. It's beginning to die out. You're beginning to question whether life should even come into being at all. And the fact that it would even occur to you as a question and should not be spontaneous and self-evident, it signifies the beginning of the end. The culture is beginning to slowly exterminate itself from within, as the Greco-Roman culture did, and you get all these problems. What do we do about the problem of birth? Do we abort the baby, or do we bring it into being? All that happened in the Roman civilization. There were birth problems. Then the birth rates declined, and gradually in the Roman Empire you get these populations just vanishing, and you get these cities out in the deserts slowly turning into these ghost towns as the soul of the civilization begins to contract and implode in on itself. That's what happens. The arts die out. They shift over into these megalopolitan arts in the civilization phase of the masses. The city, before the underpopulation, there's this overpopulation phase when the cities are gigantic and megalopolitan. And so Spengler says we have been since the 19th century about where the Greek and Roman civilization was as they were approaching the year zero, and the Roman Republic was beginning to die out and shift over into the Imperium. And at the same time, you get this reversion back to bloody politics.